And we're going to look at the medieval period to begin with. There's 4 videos in total. So 1250 to 1500, we're going to start with historical context. Each time look at living conditions, the responses to outbreaks and epidemics in the time period, and public health and government involvement. So what that looks like during the time period. So let's start with the historical context. We know at this time religion dominates the medieval mind. It's an agricultural-based society, so a society based on farming, a belief that God appoints the king, and king is at the top of the feudal system, and that creates hierarchy, and the peasants are very much at the bottom of that. This is a time period where technology is really limited. The only forms of technology really are water mills and windmills, and the ideas around understanding of the body come from the Greeks, and that idea still dominated this idea of the 4 humours, and if they were out of balance, then this is what could cause illness. Key to this in terms of attitudes and values and beliefs is this idea of religion. Okay, there's lack of understanding of disease. There is no understanding of what causes disease. And the other thing to make sure that we always consider here is this idea that it was miasma, poisoned air, that also caused disease. So the role of God and miasma are key to what we see in terms of responses to epidemics and outbreaks later on, and how public health and the government responds to issues around waste, water and food, things like that. Okay, so let's go on then and look at living conditions, and we see things are different for whether you lived in the countryside versus whether you lived in towns. So we know peasants worked the land, and 90% of the population lived in the countryside. And as a result, as I've put here, bad harvest could mean death. And the Great Famine of 1315 to 1316 was a great example of that in terms of this reliance on the harvest and to have food. Alongside that, they knew that even a good harvest could bring problems. So in damp conditions, we got this fungus that grew on rye bread, and that caused a disease called ergotism, also known as St. Anthony's fire. And that could make people very ill and give them kind of pusses and outbreaks on their skin. That kind of led to hallucinations and people going mad. So that was a big issue of the time in terms of in the countryside. Disease that could come from eating fungus that grew on rye bread. Every village we know had a stream or a spring, and that was a vital source for work and for life, whether it was for clean water, or for washing, or for animals to take a drinking, or for kind of eating fish from. A lot of villagers would drink what was called small beer. It was the most common ale, not very strong, and it was brewed from water. And although people didn't know this at the time, it did kill off germs, so it was better to drink than water. Your peasants would live in a 1-room cottage, and they'd have a garden in the back, which would have their midden in their waste heap. Okay, and any waste was then used for fertiliser on the land. Okay, often people would eat pottage, and any other waste from humans would go into what were called cesspits, holes in the ground. In towns, life was different to the countryside. So there would be roads that had some kind of paving, so some kind of slabs or cobblestones on them. The centre of the town would have a conduit, a water fountain where water could be collected from, and lead pipes would bring that spring water to the town, or there'd be water sellers selling it from leather sacks. Street vendors would sell foods, whether that was things like ale or meat, and often that meat was rancid. It was bad, it'd gone off. Okay, again causing illnesses. And there were public latrines, public toilets in the market squares, and tailors and barbers were the jobs of people who kept people clean. And they got a range of food brought in from the countryside on market day, and that would be sold. And traders selling their goods, whether that was fishmongers or butchers or tanners who would work with leather. And in the centre of all this, you've got your housing in the centre of the towns, and it was only the wealthy, though, that would have gardens. So their houses in towns would be built very close together. And the craftsmen and tradesmen that we've talked about would often have their workshop as part of their house. Now, people were meant to keep their areas around the drains and streets around their houses clean, but not everybody did. And so in London, from 1293, they had rakers to clear the streets, and most towns had these by 1500. And then the last thing, we've talked about the public latrines. Well, it was the gong firma's job to clear those cesspits and remove the waste from them, so the faeces and then take it to the outside the town walls, and it'd be used on fields or tips into streams. Okay, so that's living conditions, the way people lived. Now, the biggest epidemic in the medieval period was the Black Death, and that arrives in 1348. And we see the responses to this epidemic as it be completely and totally linked to beliefs and attitudes of the time. Okay, so because we know about the medieval mind and its belief that everything in the world depended on the will of God, what we see in terms of the responses to this epidemic linked directly to that. Okay, so the first thing to say here is that in terms of response to this, to the Black Death, is we see people praying for healing. Okay, the reliance on priests, and even going as far as we see those groups of flagellants that were sent from Northern Europe, who would walk in line, whipping the bare back of the person in front of them. And they believed that if they suffered on behalf of others, that God would then take away the plague because of their self-sacrifice. So this idea of dependence on God is really clear in what we see in terms of responses to the Black Death. Okay. Now, other kind of ideas about the causes of the Black Death were linked to the planets, and this idea that it was linked to the unusual movements of the planets, but also the other beliefs and attitudes idea around miasma, this invisible poison in the air. They also thought that was to blame. Okay. And again, that links to kind of the responses that we see people take, in that they carry in. Often people carried posies, small like groups of flowers, or burned rosemary or other sweet-scented plants, the idea being that it would purify the air of their houses, get rid of the bad smells, the invisible poison in the air, and therefore get rid of the Black Death. Okay, none of this obviously we know worked, but remember, this was the beliefs and attitudes at the time. And then lastly, we see kind of the responses people took in terms of to try and protect themselves. So the rich, we know, ran away. They tried to move to the countryside in an attempt to find pure air. We've talked about the flagellants already, whipping themselves, hoping for God's forgiveness. People who shut themselves away, hoping to kind of, by keeping themselves away, that would work and protect themselves from the Black Death. The dependence on the church, okay, and those poses. Now, in terms of kind of the role of the king at this time, King Edward III, his response is pretty limited. He writes a letter to the Mayor of London, and he gives explicit instructions. He says, clean up the city. Okay? He says, get rid of the filth lying in the streets and lanes, and remove it with speed to far distant places, and cleanse the city of London from all odour. Okay? Again, thinking that it was the miasma that was causing the Black Death. Okay. Now, all these treatments were put in place, and all these responses were put in place, but none were successful. Okay. And I've put others here, that treatments that were put in place, the use of chamomile, kind of tying live toads or chickens to the buboes to try and get rid of the disease, and bloodletting. But again, as we know, none of them worked. But this was all linked to the beliefs and attitudes of the time. Okay. Now, if we move on and look at the last aspect, public health and government involvement in that response, well, in terms of the highest standards of public health, the beginning of this time period, they were found in monasteries, and that was linked to the wealth that monasteries had. Okay, but this was a time where people were highly religious, and religious communities like monasteries needed that clean water for the ceremonies, for the washing of linen and people. And we know these institutions were rich and powerful and therefore could pay for piped water to be sent over long distances to themselves. Okay, now that does change, and we see standards in monasteries drop by 1500, and we see that the kind of wealth from wealthy people of the time in their wills is, rather than be left to churches, is now starting to be left to towns. Okay, and wealthy towns will begin to fund the development of new conduits and public privies. All right. In London specifically, London at this time leads the way in public health. Okay, and if we look at the dates, it's important that we know that this is all towards the end of the time period. So when we're thinking of clinching arguments in terms of changes in public health, we can say that they are pretty superficial and pretty limited, and all towards the end of the time period, because it's only specific areas where we see public health involvements, whether that's trying to kind of remove dung heaps in the likes of Bristol and York, or the introduction of guilds, those associations for food producers where they start to set fines and standards for people who are not meeting clean food hygiene standards, and that happens in Winchester. But these are by the town authorities, and these are down into specific areas. Now, if we look at London in 1385, the first thing we see is that there's a warden appointed to kind of check that London streets and the banks of the Thames are clear of the filth and the dung heaps. All right. By 1415, we see that the Mayor of London orders the rebuilding of the latrines because they've been flooding the neighbouring properties with sewage. And then in the 1430s, the Mayor of London again organises the extension of pipes to supply fresh water and clean spring water. And then he and other rich citizens at the time leave money in their wills to try and improve water supplies and build new public latrines. Okay, so this is the medieval period and what we see in terms of historical context, living conditions, responses to epidemics, and public health, government involvement at the time.